The wind came from the north with the voice of 10,000 wolves. It tore across the high prairie in waves that bent the winter grass flat and sent spirals of snow spinning into the iron-gray sky. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the span of an hour, and now the cold was a living thing pressing down on the land with malicious intent. Enipe felt it seeping through his buckskin coat, through the layers of wool and fur straight into his bones. He rode with his body hunched low over his pony's neck, trying to make himself small against the wind. The war bonnet he wore, eagle feathers bound with rawhide beadwork his mother had sewn before the smallpox took her, was already crusted thick with ice. Each feather had become a small icicle weighing down the ceremonial headdress until his neck ached with the burden. His 2 long braids, wrapped in strips of otter fur for warmth, had frozen stiff as rope and hung down his back like clubs. The pony beneath him was a dun-colored mare, small and compact, bred for endurance in country that killed the weak. Her name was Thashunke Washtela Good Horse, and she had carried him through 3 winters and saved his life twice. Once from a grizzly bear that had come out of hibernation early and hungry. Once from a cattle stampede when white ranchers had tried to drive him off land that they claimed was theirs. He spoke to her now in Lakota, his voice hoarse from the cold and nearly lost in the howling wind. Washte Chungshi, Washte Yellow. Good, my daughter. It is good. The mare's ears flicked back toward him, listening despite the chaos, and she pushed on. Her breath came in short, labored clouds that froze in the air before they could dissipate. Ice had formed on her muzzle and around her eyes, and Enipe could feel the tremor of exhaustion running through her muscles with each step. He could not see the freight road anymore. It had vanished beneath drifts that rose higher than a mounted man, the familiar ruts and wagon tracks erased, as if they had never existed. He was navigating by instinct now, by the shape of the land beneath the snow, by the way the wind struck his left shoulder at a particular angle, by the faint sense of emptiness that marked where the ravine dropped away to his right, a 200-foot plunge to the frozen river below. One wrong step, one moment of inattention. That was all it would take. Enipe's hands were numb inside his gloves, thick leather lined with rabbit fur that was no longer enough. He flexed his fingers, trying to keep blood flowing, but the sensation was fading. Soon he would lose all feeling, and then he would lose his grip on the reins, and then he would fall, and the cold would take him the way it took everyone who stayed out too long. He thought about turning back. It would be the smart thing to do, the sensible thing. He owed the town of Snow Peak nothing. Peak. Most of them would celebrate if he froze to death out here, one less savage to worry about, one less reminder of what they had taken and what they refused to give back. But Martha Hilda had asked him to check on the wagon. Martha was one of the few white people in Snow Peak who spoke to him like he was human. She ran the boarding house where the new school teacher stayed, and when the storm had come up fast and vicious, when the freight wagon had not returned by nightfall, Martha had walked through the blizzard to his cabin by the cottonwoods and knocked on his door. "Please," she had said, snow clinging to her gray hair, her face lined with worry. "That girl is good. Someone should look for her. Will you?" Enipe had looked at her for a long moment, weighing the odds of survival against the odds of finding anyone alive. Then he had nodded, saddled his mare, and ridden out into the teeth of the storm. Because he knew what it was like to be left behind. He thought about his sister as he rode. Zitkala, little bird. She had been 7 years old when the smallpox came, brought by traders who passed through their village on the way to Fort Laramie. The sickness had swept through the lodges like wildfire, killing the old and the young, sparing almost no one. The white doctor at the fort had refused to treat Indians. "Let them die," he had said. "It's God's will." Enepe had been 12, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to believe he could stop it. He had stayed by Zitkala's side for 4 days and 4 nights, pressing cool cloths to her burning skin, spooning water into her cracked lips, singing the healing songs their grandmother had taught him. He had prayed to Wakan Tanka for mercy, had offered tobacco, and Sage had promised anything: his own life, his future, everything he had, if only she would live. She had died on the 5th morning, just as the sun rose over the Black Hills. Her last word had been his name, spoken so softly he had to lean close to hear it. Lala. Brother. Enepe had held her small-waisted body and felt something break inside him that had never fully healed. He had learned then that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people: those who helped when help was needed, and those who looked away because helping was inconvenient or dangerous or simply too much trouble. He had decided in the years since that he would not be the one who looked away, even if it killed him. The mare stumbled her front hoof, breaking through a hidden crust of ice. She lurched forward, and for one heart-stopping moment, Enepe felt the world tilt. He grabbed her mane with both hands, his legs clamping tight around her barrel, and she caught herself, muscles bunching, hooves scrabbling for purchase on the slick ground beneath the snow. They stayed upright. Barely. Enepe's heart hammered against his ribs. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against the mare's neck, feeling the heat of her body, the solid reality of her, and whispered thanks to the spirits that watched over horses and fools. Fila Mayayapi, you have saved me. He straightened and looked around, trying to orient himself. The world was a white-out sky and ground blending into a single featureless expanse. But he could hear something beneath the wind, a faint hollow sound that meant open space. The ravine was close, too close. He urged the mare left away from the edge, and she responded immediately, her survival instinct as sharp as his. They moved slowly now, each step deliberate. The cold was getting worse. Enepe could no longer feel his feet in his moccasins, and his face had gone numb, his cheeks and nose stiff as leather. Ice had formed in his eyebrows and in the stubble on his jaw, and when he blinked his eyelashes stuck together for a moment before tearing apart. Frostbite. If he survived this, he would lose parts of himself, fingers, toes, perhaps his nose. He had seen it happen to trappers and hunters who stayed out too long. The flesh turned black and died, and you cut away the dead parts or you died with them. But that was a problem for later, if there was a later. Time became meaningless. There was only the wind, the cold, the burning ache in his arms and legs, and the stubborn, relentless forward motion of the mare beneath him. He began to hallucinate his oxygen-starved brain, conjuring images from the white chaos. He saw his father, tall and proud, wearing the war bonnet that now sat on Enepe's head. His father raised one hand in greeting, then turned and walked into the storm, fading like smoke. He saw Zitkala, small and solemn, wrapped in a blanket that was too large for her. She pointed with one thin arm, and he followed the direction she indicated without question. When he blinked, she was gone, but he realized the mare had turned slightly, and they were back on firmer ground, away from the ravine's edge. He did not know if the vision had been real or imagined. He decided it did not matter. The dead guided the living, or the living guided themselves. The result was the same. Finally, after what felt like hours but might have been less, lights appeared through the storm. Faint and wavering at first, like candles seen through deep water, but unmistakable. The lights of Snow Peak. Relief flooded through Enepe, so intense it was almost painful. He had not realized how much of him had expected to die out here until he saw those lights and understood that he might live after all. But his job was not done. He had come out here to find the wagon, to find survivors. He turned the mare back into the storm, retracing their path, searching for any sign of the freight road or the wreckage he knew must be out here somewhere. And then he saw it. A dark shape against the white, angular and wrong. The outline of a wagon tipped on its side like a child's discarded toy. Ennepe's stomach tightened. He urged the mare forward, and she obeyed, though he could feel the reluctance in her body. She knew as he did that what they were about to find would not be good. The wagon was a wreck. The front axle had snapped cleanly, the wood splintered and jutting out at odd angles. The tongue lay twisted to one side, still attached to the harness, but pointing in the wrong direction. The draft horses, two big sorrels, the kind bred for strength and endurance, were still in their traces. Both were dead. One had broken its neck in the fall, head twisted at an impossible angle. The other had died more slowly, legs tangled in the harness, ribs crushed when the wagon rolled. Blood had pooled in the snow beneath them, already frozen into dark red ice. Ennepe dismounted, boots sinking thigh-deep into the drift. The cold bit through his leggings, immediately sharp as a knife blade. He waded forward, using his hands to push through the snow, and began checking for survivors. He found the driver first. Coyle, a weathered, gray-haired man who had been hauling freight for 20 years and knew every rock and rut on these roads. He lay face down in a drift 10 feet from the wagon, one arm twisted beneath him at an unnatural angle, his head surrounded by a halo of frozen blood where it had struck a buried rock. Ennepe knelt, ignoring the cold seeping through his knees, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of Coyle's neck. The skin was already cold and stiff, like touching meat that had been left out overnight. No pulse, no warmth, no life. Ennepe closed the man's eyes. The lids were frozen, partially open, staring at nothing, and murmured a brief prayer in Lakota, asking the spirits to guide him safely to the other side. He did not know if Coyle would have wanted a Lakota prayer, but it was all Ennepe had to give. The guard was next. A young man, maybe 20, with a thin blonde beard and a company-issued rifle still clutched in one frozen hand. He wore a coat that was too thin for this weather, probably borrowed, and his face was peaceful in death, as if he had simply fallen asleep. But the side of his skull was caved in, where he had struck the wagon wheel when it tipped. Bone fragments and frozen brain matter were visible through the torn scalp. Ennepe had seen enough death to know that this one had been instant. The boy had not suffered. He covered the young man's face with a piece of torn canvas and moved on. Beneath the wagon bed, half buried in snow and sheltered by the overturned frame, he found her. A woman. Young, perhaps in her mid-20s, wearing a blue wool dress that was soaked through and frozen stiff as canvas. Her hair, dark brown, almost black, had come loose from its pins and lay in tangled coils across her face. Her lips were tinged blue, her skin so pale it looked translucent, like porcelain held up to light. One gloved hand lay outstretched in the snow, fingers curled, as if reaching for something just out of reach. Ennepe knelt beside her, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He pulled off his glove. His hand was so numb, he barely felt the air hit his skin, and pressed his fingers to the side of her throat, just below the jaw where the pulse should be. For a long moment he felt nothing. Then faint, irregular, but unmistakably there, a flutter beneath his fingertips. She was alive. Barely, but alive. Ennepe moved quickly now, working with the efficiency of someone who had pulled drowning people from rivers and dug children out of collapsed lodges. He brushed snow from her face and hair, checking for injuries. A large bruise darkened her right temple, where she had struck something hard, probably the metal edge of the wagon bed. Her breathing was shallow and slow. Each exhalation so faint, he had to lean close to be sure she was still drawing air. Her body temperature was dangerously low. He could feel it, even through her clothes, a coldness that went deeper than skin, settling into blood and bone. If he did not get her warm, and soon, she would slip into the final sleep that looked peaceful, but was anything but. He pulled the buffalo robe from his own shoulders and wrapped it around her, tucking the edges tight, creating a cocoon. Then he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp and unresisting. He could feel the delicate architecture of her bones, the way her head lolled against his shoulder, and something in his chest tightened. This was someone's daughter. Someone's friend. A person who mattered to people who were not here, who could not save her, who had trusted that she would come home safely. He would not let her die. He carried her to his mare, who stood with her head down sides, heaving steam rising from her coat. The horse looked at him with liquid brown eyes that seemed to say, "You cannot be serious." "I know," Enepe said aloud, his voice rough. "But we have no choice. We carry her or she dies, and we do not let people die. Not anymore." The mare snorted, her breath a white cloud, but she did not move away when he approached. Getting into the saddle with an unconscious woman in his arms was brutally difficult. Enepe had to brace the woman against the mare's side with one arm while using his other hand and his legs to lever himself up, every muscle screaming in protest. Once he nearly dropped her, his frozen fingers losing their grip, and had to catch her against his body in a clumsy embrace that left them both covered in snow. Finally, he was in the saddle, the woman cradled against his chest, her head tucked beneath his chin. He wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady and took the reins in his other hand. "Tokaheya Iyaya. Go first, lead us home." The mare turned into the storm and began to walk. The journey back to Snow Peak was a descent into the kind of hell that froze rather than burned. The wind screamed in Enepe's ears, a constant high-pitched wail that made thought impossible. Snow came in horizontal waves, striking his face like thrown gravel, blinding him. He bent over the woman in his arms, using his body as a shield, and let the mare pick her way forward by instinct and memory. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It was a presence, a crushing weight that pressed down on his chest and squeezed the air from his lungs. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. His fingers had gone completely numb. He could no longer feel the reins in his hand, could only trust that his frozen grip was still holding them. Ice had formed on his beard and in the fringes of his buckskin coat, weighing him down with every movement. His thighs ached from gripping the saddle. His back screamed from the unnatural position. His arms trembled with the effort of holding the woman steady, keeping her from sliding off into the snow. And the woman herself, she did not move, did not make a sound. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her body a dead weight in his arms. He could feel the faint rise and fall of her breathing so shallow, it was almost imperceptible. And he pressed his cheek against her frozen hair and whispered to her in Lakota words he did not think she could hear, but that he needed to say. "Napiche yuzayo, wanietu kinde ohia unyapikta." Hold on, we will survive this winter together. "Wikoni yaksimpikta, kantewashte." You must want to live. Be brave. The mare stumbled again, this time more severely. Her front legs broke through a weak spot in the snow, and she plunged forward chest deep in the drift. Enepe felt the sickening lurch of falling, felt the woman start to slip from his grip, and he clamped down hard with his legs and pulled her tight against him, refusing to let her go. The mare thrashed, panicked, trying to find solid ground. For a moment, they were all going to go down, horseman and woman, tumbling into the snow together, where they would freeze within minutes. Then the mare's hooves found purchase. She lunged upward, muscles bunching, and they were moving again. Enepe's heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst. He was shaking from fear, from cold, from exhaustion, and he had to force himself to breathe, to stay calm, to keep moving. The woman stirred slightly in his arms, a tiny movement, barely more than a twitch. Her lips moved, and he thought he heard her whisper something, a name or a prayer he could not tell. Then she went still again. "Stay with me," Enepe said in English this time, his voice hoarse and cracking. "We are close. Stay with me." He did not know if it was true. He had lost all sense of time and distance. The world had narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the next heartbeat. And then finally, mercifully, lights appeared again through the white curtain. Closer this time. Real. Snow Peak. Enepe urged the mare forward, and she responded, summoning reserves of strength he had not known she possessed. They entered the town, moving down the center of the main street, hooves crunching through snow with a sound like breaking bones. Doors began to open. Faces appeared in windows, pale and startled. A woman gasped. A man shouted something that was lost in the wind. Enepe kept riding, heading for the small clapboard building at the end of the street, where Dr. Elijah Moore kept his surgery. But before he reached it, a crowd began to form, spilling out of the saloon and the general store, gathering in the street despite the killing cold. Enepe reined in the mare and looked down at them. He knew what they saw, a Lakota warrior on a half-dead horse dressed in full regalia, his war bonnet crusted with ice, his face a mask of frost and exhaustion. And in his arms, wrapped in a buffalo robe, an unconscious white woman in a blue dress, her pale face stark against the dark fur. The image was surreal, almost mythic. The savage and the innocent, the monster and his prey. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a voice from the back of the crowd yelled, "He's got her! The Indians got the school teacher." Another voice, louder, "Told you he'd take one. Told you we should have driven him out when we had the chance." A murmur ran through the crowd, rising in pitch and volume, fear feeding anger, and anger feeding fear. Hands moved toward gun belts. Men stepped forward, their faces hard. "Where's Coyle?" someone demanded. "Where's the guard?" "Dead." Enepe said, his voice raw from the cold and barely audible over the wind. "Both dead. I found her alive and brought her back. She needs help. Now." "You expect us to believe that—" A man near the front spat into the snow. "More likely you killed them and took her. We should string you up right now, save everyone the trouble." The crowd pressed closer, and Enepe felt the situation spiraling out of control. His hand moved to the knife at his belt, not to draw it, but to be ready. If they rushed him, he would go down fighting. But the woman in his arms would die. Then a voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding as a whip crack. "Get out of the way, all of you." Dr. Elijah Moore pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in one hand, his face set in an expression of fury that made even the loudest men step back. He was a lean man in his 50s, with gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. And he carried himself with the authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with death and had no patience left for stupidity. "If you fools want to stand around arguing while a woman freezes to death, that's on your conscience." Elijah snapped. "But I will not be party to it. Enepe, bring her inside, now." He turned and strode toward his surgery without waiting to see if anyone followed. Enepe urged the mare forward. The crowd parted reluctantly, men stepping aside with muttered curses and dark looks. Someone threw a snowball that struck his shoulder. Another voice yelled, "Murderer!" Enepe ignored them all. He had learned long ago that you could not reason with fear. He rode to the front of Elijah's building, dismounted with the woman still in his arms, his legs nearly buckled when they hit the ground. But he locked his knees and stayed upright and carried her up the steps. The door swung open, releasing a blast of warm air that smelled of carbolic wood smoke and coffee. It was the most beautiful thing Enepe had ever smelled. Elijah gestured toward a table in the center of the room. "Put her there. Gently." Enepe laid her down as carefully as he could, though his arms were shaking so badly he could barely control them. The buffalo robe fell away, revealing the full extent of her condition. Her dress was soaked through and frozen in places, the fabric stiff and crackling when he tried to smooth it. Ice clung to her hair and eyelashes, giving her the appearance of a frost sculpture rather than a living person. Elijah bent over her, immediately pressing his fingers to her throat, then her wrist, then placing his ear near her mouth to listen for breathing. His expression was grim. Her pulse is weak and irregular. She's cold clear through, right down to the bone. We must warm her slowly, or the strain might stop her heart. He looked up at Enepe, up at, how long has she been like this? I do not know exactly. I found her perhaps an hour ago. Maybe more. The storm made it difficult to track time. Elijah nodded, already moving, pulling supplies from shelves and cabinets. You did well to bring her back alive. Most men would not have tried. Many would not have survived the attempt. He began cutting away her coat and dress with surgical scissors, working quickly but carefully. I need you to stay. Keep that stove fed and hot. Boil water. Strip down and warm yourself before you collapse. You're not much better off than she is. Enepe moved to the cast-iron stove in the corner and began feeding it split logs from the woodpile beside it. His hands shook so badly he could barely grip the wood, and twice he dropped pieces that clattered across the floor. Now that he was out of the wind, out of the immediate danger, the full weight of exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. His vision swam. His legs wobbled. Black spots danced at the edges of his sight. Elijah glanced over and said sharply, "Sit down before you fall down." "I am fine." Enepe said, though he was not fine at all. "You are half frozen and in the early stages of hypothermia. Sit down. That is not a request." Enepe sat. Outside, the crowd was still gathered voices rising and falling like the howl of the wind. Through the small frosted window, Enepe could see men gesturing angrily, pointing toward the surgery. One man, Barnaby Dietrich, the mine owner, unmistakable even at a distance, in his expensive wool coat and bowler hat, stood at the center of the group, speaking in that calm, measured voice that somehow carried authority even when he was lying. Enepe could not hear the words, but he knew their shape. The Indian killed them. The Indian staged a rescue. The Indian is dangerous. He had heard it all before, would hear it again. It never changed. But for now, he did not care what they thought. The woman was alive. That was what mattered. Elijah worked in focused silence, his movements precise and methodical. He wrapped the woman in warmed blankets, placed heated bricks wrapped in cloth to prevent burns around her body, and monitored her pulse and breathing every few minutes. He warmed water on the stove and used it to gently clean the ice from her hair and face his touch as tender as if she were his own daughter. "What is her name?" Enepe asked quietly, his voice still rough. Elijah checked the inside of her coat collar where a line of neat stitching spelled out a name in black thread. "Celine Arnaud. She came here from New Orleans about 3 months ago. Hired as the schoolteacher and part-time bookkeeper for Barnaby's mining company." He paused, his expression troubled. "She was on that wagon for a reason. Barnaby sent her to the northern camp with payroll and company documents." "The payroll is gone," Enepe said. "I saw the strongbox, broken open, empty." Elijah's hands stilled for a moment. Then he shook his head and returned to his work. "First things first. Let's keep her alive. Questions can wait." Hours passed. The storm continued to rage outside, rattling the windows and shaking the walls with each gust. Inside, the surgery was warm and quiet, filled with the crackle of the fire and the sound of Elijah's steady breathing as he worked. At some point, Martha Hilda arrived with a basket of food, still warm bread, cheese, and a jar of beef stew that steamed when she opened it. She took one look at Enepe, still sitting by the stove in wet clothes, and said bluntly, "You look like death. Eat." Enepe ate. The food was simple but good, and it steadied him, brought warmth back to his core that the stove alone could not provide. Martha looked at Celine lying on the table, then at Elijah. "Will she live?" "I don't know yet," Elijah said honestly. "The next 12 to 24 hours will tell. If she wakes, if her temperature stabilizes, then yes. If not." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Martha nodded grimly. She turned to Enepe and laid a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for going out there, for bringing her back. I will not forget what you did." "It was the right thing to do," Enepe said simply. "Most folks around here don't do the right thing." Martha said, her voice hard. "They do the easy thing, the safe thing. You did different. That matters." She left, and the surgery fell silent again, except for the crackle of the fire and the faint, steady rhythm of Celine's breathing. Enepe dozed in the chair by the stove, too exhausted to stay fully awake, but too wired to truly sleep. He dreamed in fragments, snow and wind. In Zitkala's face, the sound of breaking ice and the smell of blood, and through it all, the faint, stubborn pulse of a heart that refused to stop beating. When he woke, it was near dawn. The storm had finally begun to ease, the wind dropping from a scream to a low moan. Pale gray light filtered through the window, illuminating the surgery in shades of pearl and shadow. Celine Arnaud lay on the table still unconscious, but her breathing was deeper now, more regular. Color had begun to return to her cheeks, a faint flush of pink, replacing the deathly pallor. Elijah sat slumped in his chair beside her asleep, his spectacles askew on his nose. Enepe stood slowly, his body protesting every movement, and walked to the table. He looked down at the woman he had carried through the storm and this stranger whose life had become entangled with his in ways neither of them had chosen. Her face was fine-boned and delicate with high cheekbones and a straight nose. Dark lashes lay against pale skin like brush strokes on porcelain. Her hair, now dry, was a deep chestnut brown, thick and wavy, spread across the pillow like spilled silk. There was strength in the set of her jaw, a certain stubbornness in the line of her mouth, even in unconsciousness. And Enepe found himself wondering what kind of person she was when she was awake and well. He wondered if she would remember anything, if she would be afraid of him when she woke, if she would believe the lies that Barnaby was already spreading through the town. He wondered if she knew how close she had come to dying, and how close he had come to letting her not through malice, but through simple exhaustion and the human impulse to save oneself first. Outside, the town of Snow Peak began to stir. Men shoveled snow from boardwalks and hitched teams to wagons. Women hung laundry that would freeze stiff before it dried. Life went on indifferent to miracles and tragedies alike. And in a saloon office above the main street, Barnaby Dietrich sat with a glass of whiskey and a frown looking at the papers spread across his desk. Invoices, ledgers, accounts that did not quite balance, and calculating how much damage the schoolteacher could do if she woke up and started asking the wrong questions. He poured another drink and began to plan. Celine Arnaud woke to pain. Not the sharp, immediate agony of a fresh wound, but a deep, bone-aching throb that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. It radiated from her extremities, fingers, toes, ears inward, as if something inside her was trying to claw its way to the surface. She tried to move, and found that her body would not obey, her limbs heavy and disconnected, as if they belonged to someone else. She opened her eyes, even that small movement hurt, and saw a water-stained plank ceiling above her. Pale winter sunlight filtered through a small window to her left, casting long shadows across rough wooden walls. The room smelled of carbolic wood smoke and something medicinal she could not identify. A voice spoke nearby, low and calm. "Easy, miss. Don't try to move yet. You've been unconscious for nearly 2 days." Celine turned her head slowly, wincing at the spike of pain the movement caused. and saw an older man with gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles sitting in a chair beside her. He had the look of a physician, steady hands kind, but tired eyes, a certain weariness around the mouth that came from seeing too much death. "Who?" Her voice came out as a croak, her throat raw and painful. "Dr. Elijah Moore," the man said. He held a tin cup to her lips. "Drink, small sips." The water was cool and sweet, the best thing she had ever tasted. She drank carefully, feeling strength return in tiny increments with each swallow. "Where am I?" "My surgery, in Snow Peak." Elijah set the cup aside. "Do you remember what happened?" Memory crashed back in a flood of images and sensations. The wagon lurching, Hank's cold eyes and the sound of his knife cutting leather, the horses screaming, the world tilting, spinning, and then the impact, hard, brutal, driving the air from her lungs. Cold. Darkness. The certainty that she was dying. "Coil." She gasped, tears filling her eyes. "And Peter's, are they?" Elijah's expression told her everything before he spoke. "I'm sorry. They didn't survive." Grief hit her like a fist to the stomach. She closed her eyes, but that only made it worse. She could see their faces, hear Coyle's kind voice as he helped her into the wagon that morning, see Peter's nervous smile as he checked his rifle. They had been alive, and now they were not. And it was because of her, because she had carried evidence that Barnaby wanted destroyed. "It's not your fault," Elijah said gently, as if reading her thoughts. "The storm." "It wasn't the storm." Celine said, her voice steadier now, despite the tears. "It was deliberate. Hank cut the harness. I saw him. He caused the crash, and then he left us to die." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain." Celine opened her eyes and looked at him directly. "I watched him cut the strap with his knife. He fired a shot to panic the horses. And then, after the wagon went over, I heard him searching through the wreckage. He took the payroll. He was looking for something else too, but—" She paused, calculating how much to tell this man she did not yet know if she could trust. But he didn't find it. What was he looking for? Celine studied Elijah's face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. She saw only honest concern. It was a risk, but everything in this godforsaken town was a risk, and she needed allies. "Evidence," she said quietly. "Proof that Barnaby Dietrich has been stealing from the mining company, from the workers, from everyone. I was hired to investigate him, not just to teach school. That was my cover. The investors in Philadelphia suspected fraud, but they needed someone who could get close enough to examine the books without raising suspicion." Elijah's eyebrows rose. "And did you—" "Yes. I found proof of a wage theft or shipment fraud, and at least 3 murders disguised as mining accidents. I copied the most damaging pages and hid them. Barnaby must have found out somehow. The wagon crash wasn't an accident. It was an attempt to kill me and destroy the evidence. Where are the papers now? Sewn into the hem of my dress, if they survived." Elijah stood and walked to a chair in the corner where her blue dress lay folded, cleaned of snow and dried, but still bearing the stains of mud and blood. He brought it back to the bed and handed it to her. "Check." Celine's hands trembled as she ran her fingers along the hem of the skirt. The stitching was intact. She felt the slight thickness where the folded pages lay hidden, and relief so intense it made her dizzy washed over her. "They're still here," she whispered. "Then we have a problem," Elijah said quietly. "If Barnaby thinks those papers were destroyed in the crash, you might be safe for a little while. But if he suspects you survived with them—" "He'll try again," Celine finished. I know. The door opened, and both of them turned. A Lakota man stood in the doorway, snow dusting the shoulders of his buckskin coat, a bundle of firewood in his arms. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone by a particularly unforgiving sculptor. His dark eyes moved from Elijah to Celine, assessing watchful, giving nothing away. "She's awake," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Elijah said. "Celine, this is Enepe." "Enepe, Miss Arnaud?" Celine looked at the man who had saved her life, because she knew instinctively with a certainty she could not explain that this was the person who had found her, who had brought her back from the edge of death. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the raw red mark around his throat that looked like a rope burn, fresh and still healing. She understood with sudden clarity that saving her had cost him something. "Thank you," she said, and her voice broke despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Dr. Moore told me you went out into the storm. You found me. You brought me back. You saved my life." Enepe set the firewood down beside the stove with deliberate care. "You don't need to thank me. It was the right thing to do. Most people wouldn't have tried. I'm not most people." He said it without arrogance or false modesty, simply stating a fact. Celine studied him more closely. She saw the wariness in the way he held himself, the careful distance he maintained, the way his eyes tracked movements in the room, as if always calculating escape routes or threats. She realized he expected her to be afraid of him, expected her to believe whatever lies the town was spreading. "Dr. Moore also told me what people are saying," she said quietly. "That you caused the crash, that you killed Coyle and Peters. It's not true. I remember what happened. Hank cut the harness. He fired a shot to panic the horses. He caused the accident deliberately, and then he left us to die in the snow." Enepe's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of surprise perhaps, or relief. "You saw this?" "Yes, I saw it clearly." "Will you tell the sheriff?" "I'll tell anyone who will listen." Celine said, her voice hardening. "Barnaby Dietrich tried to have me murdered. I will not let him succeed, and I will not let him destroy you for saving my life." Enepe exchanged a glance with Elijah. Some unspoken communication passed between them, years of friendship compressed into a single look. "If you accuse Barnaby publicly," Enepe said carefully, "he'll come after you again. And this time he won't rely on a storm or an accident. He'll be direct." "I know." Celine met his eyes without flinching. "But I have proof. Evidence that he's been stealing and murdering for years. If I can get it to the investors in Philadelphia, they'll destroy him. His money, his power, everything he's built on lies and blood, it will all come down." "Evidence can be destroyed," Enepe said. "Or stolen, or you can be silenced before you send it." "Then I'll need help," Celine said. She looked between the two men. "Will you help me?" Elijah answered first without hesitation. "Yes, of course." Enepe was silent for a longer moment, his gaze distant as if considering something complex. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes." "Why?" Celine asked him directly. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing. And helping me will put you in even more danger than you're already in." Enepe looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but absolute. "I went into that storm because my sister died when no one would help her. Because I decided a long time ago that I would not be the person who looks away when someone needs help. And because—" He paused, choosing his words with care. "Because you are not the only one who has been called a liar and a criminal for telling the truth. Barnaby Dietrich is a monster who hides behind money and respectability. Monsters should not be allowed to win." Celine felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. This man, this stranger the town called a savage, was more honorable than most so-called civilized people she had ever met. "Then we stand together," she said softly. Together, Enepe agreed. Over the next 5 days, Celine recovered under Elijah's watchful care and Enepe's silent protection. The pain she had woken to the deep, throbbing ache in her extremities was the sensation of blood returning to tissue that had been on the verge of freezing. Elijah called it thaw pain and warned her it would get worse before it got better. He was right. For the first 2 days, every movement was agony. Her fingers and toes felt like they were being jabbed with thousands of hot needles. Her ears burned, even her scalp hurt. But slowly, gradually, sensation returned to normal. The bruise on her temple faded from purple to yellow-green. Her strength came back in increments. First, the ability to sit up without dizziness, then to stand, then to walk the length of the surgery, without needing to rest. Enepe came every morning with firewood and game rabbit venison, once a brace of wild turkeys shot with arrows, so precisely placed they had died instantly without damaging the meat. He spoke rarely, but his presence was steady and reassuring, a constant that Celine found herself looking forward to with an intensity that surprised her. She began to watch him when he thought she was not looking. The economy of his movements, the way he could cross a room without making a sound, and the way he listened with his whole body. Head tilted slightly, as if hearing things beyond the range of normal ears. His hands were scarred thin white lines that spoke of old cuts and thorns, the rough work of survival. But they moved with surprising gentleness when he fed the stove or set down a basket of food. Once she asked him how he had found her in the storm. He was adjusting a log in the stove at the time, and he paused, firelight flickering across his face. "I followed the trail as long as I could. When the trail disappeared, I read the land, the shape of the drifts, the direction of the wind, the way sound carries near the ravine." He closed the stove door and straightened. "And I listened for what was not supposed to be there, the sound of wreckage of metal and wood, where there should be only snow." "That's remarkable," Celine said. "I've never met anyone who could do that." Enepe shrugged. "It's what I do. It's how I survive in a world that does not want me." He looked at her directly. "You survived too. That's more remarkable. Most people would have given up when the wagon crashed, would have just stopped fighting." "I couldn't," Celine said quietly. "I had to live long enough to make sure Barnaby paid for what he's done. For Coyle and Peters. For all the others." "Revenge is a cold companion," Enepe said. "It's not revenge. It's justice. There's a difference. Sometimes. Not always." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Tell me about your family. Where you come from." The question surprised her. Most people in Snow Peak never asked about her past, never seemed to care where she had come from or why. But Enepe waited patient, and Celine found herself wanting to answer. "I was born in Haiti," she said. "My family fled to New Orleans during the Revolution when I was very young. My father was a clerk, my mother a seamstress. They worked hard, saved money, tried to build something safe. But yellow fever took them both when I was 16. She paused, the old grief still sharp after all these years. "I've been on my own since then, working as a governess, a shop clerk, a bookkeeper, whatever I could find that would let me survive with my dignity intact." "I'm sorry," Enepe said, and the simple sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. "It's hard to lose family." "You lost your sister," Celine said. "Elijah told me." Enepe nodded slowly. "Zitkala. She was 7. Smallpox. The white doctor at the fort wouldn't treat Indians. Said it was God's will that we die." His jaw tightened. "I stayed with her for 4 days, trying everything I knew. It wasn't enough. "I'm sorry," Celine said. "That's not right. It's not fair." "No," Enepe agreed. "It's not. But the world is not built on fairness. It's built on power and who has it and who doesn't. You and I, we don't have power. So we have to be smarter, braver, more stubborn." Celine felt something shift between them, a recognition passing like an electrical current. Two people who had been discarded by the world, who had refused to stay discarded, who had clawed their way to survival through sheer force of will. "Tell me about your language," she said impulsively. "Lakota, will you teach me some words?" Enepe looked surprised. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to live here, I should learn. And because—" She hesitated, then said honestly, "Because I want to understand you better." Something in Enepe's expression softened just slightly. He thought for a moment, then said, "Washte." It means good. "Filamaya." "Thank you." "Mitakuye oyasang." "All my relations." It's a prayer and a reminder that everything is connected. Celine repeated the words carefully, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. "Washte, Filamaya, Mitakuye oyasang." "Good," Enepe said, and for the first time since she had met him, he smiled, a small, fleeting expression, but genuine. "You learn quickly." "Teach me more," Celine said. "Please, I'll teach you something in return. Whatever you want to learn." "I want to read better," Enepe said quietly. "I know some English words enough to get by. But contracts, legal documents, the things white men use to take what they want, I can't read those well enough to protect my people." "Then I'll teach you," Celine said. "We'll trade, language for language, knowledge for knowledge." And so they did. Every afternoon, when Celine was strong enough, they sat at Elijah's small desk with a battered copy of McGuffey's Reader and whatever newspapers Elijah had lying around. Celine taught Enepe to sound out complex words, to parse sentences, to understand the formal legalistic language that appeared in contracts and deeds. Enepe was a patient, methodical student. He did not rush, did not guess. He took his time with each word, breaking it down into component parts, committing it to memory before moving on. His focus was absolute, and Celine found herself impressed by the intelligence that lay beneath his silence. In return, he taught her Lakota words and phrases, the names of animals and plants, the words for family relationships, for weather, for the sacred things that had no direct English translation. He taught her to listen to the wind, to read tracks in the snow, to move quietly through a room without disturbing the air. They fell into a rhythm, these two outsiders, and something grew between them that was not quite friendship and not quite something else. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared determination. But outside the safety of Elijah's surgery, the town was turning poisonous. Barnaby Dietrich was a patient man. He had not built his empire by acting rashly or letting emotion cloud his judgment. When Heavy Hank had returned from the wagon crash with the news that the schoolteacher was probably dead and the evidence destroyed, Barnaby had allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before immediately beginning to calculate contingencies. What if she had survived? What if the papers had not been destroyed? What if someone went back to the wreck and found something incriminating? So he waited, watched. And when word came that the Indian had brought Celine Arnaud back alive, Barnaby did not panic. He simply adjusted his strategy. If he could not kill her openly, and he could not with too many people having seen the rescue, not with Elijah standing guard, then he would destroy her credibility. Make the town doubt her. Make them fear the Indian more than they trusted her word. Fear was easy to weaponize. Barnaby had been doing it for years. He started in the saloon, as he always did, buying rounds for the loudest men and speaking in that calm, reasonable voice that made even the most outrageous lies sound like common sense. I'm glad the schoolteacher survived, he would say, shaking his head with false concern. But I have to wonder, did she really see what she says she saw? She hit her head badly. Concussion. She was half frozen for hours. The mind plays tricks under those conditions. What are you saying? Someone would ask. I'm not saying anything. Barnaby would reply, all innocence. I'm just pointing out that traumatic experiences can confuse memory. And the Indian, well, we only have his word about what happened out there. He was alone with the wagon for quite some time before he brought her back. You think he killed Coyle and Peters? Barnaby would spread his hands. I don't want to think that. But we have to consider all possibilities. Coyle was found with a broken neck. The guard had his skull crushed. And the payroll, $300, vanished. Where did it go? The poison spread slowly, dripping into conversations, coloring perceptions. Within days, a significant portion of Snow Peak's population believed that Inepe had caused the crash, killed the two men, stolen the money, and somehow manipulated or threatened the confused schoolteacher into covering for him. It did not matter that there was no evidence. Fear did not need evidence. Sheriff Robert Harlan heard the talk and felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a yoke. He sat in his office with a glass of whiskey he had poured, but had not yet drunk, staring at the wanted posters on his wall, and felt the familiar gnaw of self-loathing in his gut. He knew Inepe had not caused the crash. He had gone out to the wreck with Inepe, and Elijah had seen the cut harness with his own eyes, had found the scrap of ledger paper in the empty strongbox. He knew Barnaby was lying. But knowing and acting were two different things. Harlan lifted the glass of whiskey, watched the amber liquid catch the lamplight, and thought about the man he used to be. Deadshot. Harlan, they had called him during the war. The sharpshooter who could pick off a Confederate officer at 500 yards, who never missed, who had been brave enough to stand on exposed ridgelines while bullets whined past his head. That man was gone. Drowned in a bottle somewhere between Antietam and this godforsaken mining town. Harlan set the glass down without drinking and looked at his service revolver hanging on the wall in its holster. The weight of it. The promise. Not yet, he told himself. But soon. Soon he would have to choose which man he wanted to be, the drunk who looked away or the man who stood up. One evening, Inepe came to see him. Harlan looked up from his desk. He had been staring at a report he was supposed to file, the words swimming in front of his eyes, and felt something twist in his gut when he saw the Lakota standing in the doorway, silent and watchful as always. What do you want? Harlan asked, his voice coming out harsher than intended. I want to know if you're going to do your job, Inepe said quietly. Or if you're going to let Barnaby turn this town into a mob that will tear me apart. Harlan felt his face flush. I'm doing my job. Are you? Inepe stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. You know I didn't cause that crash. You saw the evidence. But you say nothing while Barnaby spreads lies. You drink and you look away, and you let innocent people suffer because it's easier than standing up. I say nothing because I have no proof that will hold up. Harlan shot back. It's your word and the schoolteacher's word against Barnaby and Hank and half the damn town. And in case you haven't noticed, your word doesn't count for much around here. So, you'll let them hang me to keep the peace. Harlan looked away. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Inepe's voice was flat, devoid of anger or judgment, which somehow made it cut deeper. You were a brave man once, Sheriff. I've heard the stories. Deadshot Harlan, the sharpshooter who never missed, who stood on ridgelines while bullets flew. But you buried that man in a whiskey bottle, and now there's nothing left but fear and excuses. Harlan's hand clenched into a fist. Get out. I will, Inepe said. But when they come for me, and they will come, you'll have to choose. You can stand with them, or you can stand with the truth. But you can't stand nowhere. That time is over." He turned and left, and Harlan sat alone in the silence, his hands shaking the glass of whiskey glowing on his desk like an accusation. For a long time, he stared at it. Then slowly, deliberately, he poured it back into the bottle without drinking. It was the first time he had done that in 5 years. The breaking point came on a cold, clear morning when the sky was blue as glacial ice and the wind bit with teeth made of razors. Celine had returned to teaching. The schoolhouse was a drafty plank building with gaps in the walls and a potbelly stove that barely kept the cold at bay, but it was hers, and the children needed her. They stared at her with wide, curious eyes, some frightened, some fascinated, and she knew they had heard the rumors. But she taught them anyway, reading and arithmetic and the names of states and capitals, because surrendering to fear felt like dying. Enepe stayed close, but not obviously so. He would not sit in the schoolhouse, that would have caused too much trouble. But he was always within sight, always watching. He sat on a bench outside the general store and carved small figures from scraps of wood whistles for the children birds with spread wings. He walked his mare past the school at irregular intervals, making sure Celine was safe. Small Sam, the 12-year-old stable boy, had become Enepe's shadow. The boy followed him everywhere, asking questions, watching how he moved, trying to learn. Sam's father had been killed in a mining accident 2 years ago, one of the deaths Celine had documented in her hidden ledgers, and Sam had been alone and angry ever since. Enepe gave him purpose, and the boy latched onto it with desperate intensity. On this particular morning, a group of 5 miners gathered outside the saloon. They had been drinking since dawn, working up their courage fueled by Barnaby's whiskey and Heavy Hank's carefully constructed lies. By mid-morning, they were ready. Celine was in the middle of a geography lesson, showing her students where Montana Territory was on the map, explaining how Snow Peak fit into the larger world, when the door slammed open. The 5 men filled the doorway, their bulk blocking the light. Celine recognized them. Mackenzie, a broad-shouldered Scotsman with a red beard. O'Rourke, an Irishman with a crooked nose and missing teeth. And 3 others whose names she did not know, but whose anger she could feel radiating like heat from a forge. The children gasped. One of the younger girls began to cry. Celine straightened, positioning herself between the men and her students. Her heart hammered, but she kept her voice level. "Gentlemen, can I help you?" "We want to talk," Mackenzie said, his accent thick. "About what happened. About the wagon." "I've already told Sheriff Harlan what happened," Celine said. "Hank sabotaged the wagon and left us to die. Enepe saved my life." O'Rourke shook his head. "That's not what we heard, miss. We heard the Indian killed Coyle and Peters, took the payroll, maybe did worse to you things a lady wouldn't want to say." Rage flooded through Celine, hot and bright. "That is a vile lie, and you know it. I remember exactly what happened. I saw Hank cut the harness with my own eyes." "Maybe you're confused," one of the other men suggested, not unkindly. "You hit your head. You were half frozen. Maybe the Indian told you what to say." "I know what I saw." Celine's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "And I'm not confused or frightened or manipulated. Enepe saved my life at great risk to his own, and Barnaby Dietrich is lying to cover up his crimes." Mackenzie's face darkened. He stepped forward, and Celine fought the urge to step back. "We don't want trouble, miss. But the town deserves answers. And if you're protecting the Indian because you're scared of him—" "I'm not scared of Enepe," Celine said clearly. "I'm scared of men like you who would rather believe comfortable lies than face uncomfortable truths." Outside, Enepe heard the raised voices. He dropped the piece of wood he had been carving and moved toward the schoolhouse, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Small Sam, who had been watching from the stable, ran after him. Enepe reached the door just as Mackenzie grabbed Celine's arm. "Let her go," Enepe said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like the crack of a whip. The men turned. Mackenzie's hand stayed on Celine's arm. "This is none of your business, Indian." "It's my business when you put your hands on her." Enepe stepped into the room, and despite the fact that he was outnumbered 5-1, something in his bearing made the men hesitate. "Let her go. Now." "Or what?" Mackenzie sneered. "You'll kill us like you killed Coyle." "I didn't kill Coyle. But if you don't release her, I'll make you regret ever touching her." For a moment, no one moved. The air crackled with tension, violence hanging in the balance. Then Sheriff Harlan stepped into the doorway, his service revolver drawn, and pointed at the floor. "Everyone calm down," he said. His voice was steady, and his hand did not shake. "Mackenzie, let her go. All of you get out of here, now." Mackenzie hesitated, then released Celine's arm and stepped back. "We're just asking questions, Sheriff." "Ask them somewhere else," Harlan said coldly. "And if I hear you've been bothering Miss Arnaud or any of her students again, I'll lock you up for disturbing the peace." "Understood." The men grumbled, but filed out, casting dark looks at Enepe as they passed. Mackenzie paused in the doorway and looked back. "This isn't over, Indian." "I know," Enepe said calmly. When they were gone, Harlan holstered his gun and looked at Celine. "Are you all right, miss?" "I'm fine," Celine said, though her hands were shaking. "Thank you." Harlan nodded curtly, then turned to Enepe. His expression was troubled. "You need to leave town, tonight. Barnaby's stirring them up, and once they're drunk enough and angry enough, they'll come for you. I can't stop a mob." "I'm not leaving," Enepe said. "Then you're a fool. They'll kill you." "Maybe. But I won't run from cowards and liars." Harlan stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head and walked out without another word. Celine turned to Enepe, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He's right. You should go. They'll kill you if you stay. And leave you here alone." Enepe shook his head. "No. They're not after me. They're after you." "They'll come for you eventually," Enepe said. "Once I'm gone, you'll be the only witness left. Barnaby can't afford to let you live." Celine knew he was right. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire in the stove. "So, what do we do?" "We wait," Enepe said. "We prepare, and when they come, we survive." That night, Barnaby made his move. He called a meeting in the saloon, bought rounds for every man who showed up, and spoke in his smooth, concerned voice about the safety of the town and the safety of their families. He did not explicitly call for violence, he was too clever for that. But he planted the seeds and let them grow in the fertile soil of fear and anger. "We need to protect ourselves," he said, his voice carrying over the crowded room. "We need to protect our women and children. And sometimes protecting ourselves means making hard choices." Heavy Hank stood and said loudly, "The Indian should be arrested, held until we know the truth." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Harlan, standing in the corner with his arms crossed, felt every eye in the room turn toward him. He could feel the weight of expectation, the pressure to act, to do something, anything, to make the problem go away. He thought about Enepe's words. "You can't stand nowhere. That time is over." He thought about the man he used to be. Deadshot Harlan, the man who never missed, who stood on ridge lines while bullets flew. He thought about the glass of whiskey he had poured back into the bottle instead of drinking. "No," Harlan said. The room went silent. Barnaby's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon?" I said no. Harlan pushed away from the wall and stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "I will not arrest an innocent man. I went to the wreck. I saw the cut harness. I found evidence of sabotage. And Miss Arno's testimony is clear. Hank cut that harness on purpose. This wasn't an accident. It was attempted murder." Barnaby's face hardened. "You're mistaken, Sheriff. You're drunk." "I'm sober," Harlan said, his voice rising. "For the first time in years, I'm sober. And I can see clearly. Enepe saved that woman's life. He rode into a storm that would have killed anyone else because it was the right thing to do. And if any of you go after him, you'll answer to me first." For a moment, just a moment, Harlan thought he had won. He saw doubt flicker across some faces, saw men exchange uncertain glances. Then Barnaby smiled. "Then I suppose," Barnaby said softly, "we no longer need a sheriff." The mob moved. They came for Enepe at midnight, 20 men with torches and rope, and the kind of righteous fury that only comes from fear given a target. Celine was staying at Martha Hilda's boarding house, in the same small room she had rented when she first arrived in Snow Peak. She woke to the sound of shouting, the orange flicker of torchlight dancing across her ceiling. Her heart lurched. She knew instantly and with terrible certainty what was happening. She threw on her coat and ran downstairs. Martha was already awake, standing in the parlor in her nightgown, a rifle in her weathered hands. "Get back upstairs, girl. This isn't safe." "I can't," Celine said, pushing past her. "They're going after Enepe." "Then he'll have to take care of himself. You go out there, you'll just get yourself killed." "I don't care." Celine wrenched open the front door. "I'm not letting them murder him." She ran into the street. The mob had surrounded Dr. Elijah's surgery, where Enepe had been staying in the small storage room on the first floor. Men crowded the porch and filled the street, their torches casting wild dancing shadows. Voices rose in an ugly chant. "Bring him out! Bring him out! Bring him out!" Someone threw a rock through the window. Glass shattered the sound, sharp and final. "Come out, Indian!" Mackenzie roared from the center of the crowd. Come out or we'll burn you out." Celine shoved her way through the mob, elbowing and kicking when men tried to grab her. "Stop this! He's innocent. You're making a terrible mistake." Hands seized her, pulling her back. She fought, screaming, until she saw Sheriff Harlan standing on the surgery porch, his revolver drawn and pointed at the sky. "Get back," Harlan said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "All of you get back or I start shooting." The crowd hesitated, uncertain. Barnaby Dietrich stepped forward from the edge of the mob, his face a mask of false concern. "Sheriff, we just want to talk to him, to ask some questions." "No," Harlan said flatly. "You want to hang him, and I won't let it happen." "Then you're a traitor," Heavy Hank called from somewhere in the back of the crowd, his voice carrying. The mob surged forward. Harlan fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the revolver echoed through the street, and men froze. "Next one goes into the first man who takes another step." Harlan said, his voice deadly calm. For a moment, a fragile, tenuous moment it held. Then someone threw a torch. It arced through the broken window and landed inside the surgery. Within seconds, flames began to lick up the curtains, spreading across the dry wood walls with terrifying speed. Smoke billowed out thick and black. Harlan cursed and kicked the door open. "Enepe, get out now." Enepe emerged from the smoke, coughing, his eyes streaming. He carried his knife in one hand and his rifle in the other, and despite the chaos, he moved with that same economical grace, wasting no motion. Harlan grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the back door. "This way. Move." They burst out into the alley behind the surgery, Celine tearing free from the hands holding her and running to join them. The mob, realizing their prey was escaping, roared and gave chase. "The livery?" Harlan gasped. "Get to the horses. I'll hold them off as long as I can." "You'll die," Enepe said. "Maybe. But I owe you this. I owe myself this." Harlan turned and fired another shot into the air, forcing the mob to scatter. "Go now." Enepe hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then he grabbed Celine's hand and ran. They reached the livery stable just as the mob rounded the corner behind them. Enepe threw the doors open, and they stumbled inside into the dim, close space that smelled of hay and horse sweat and leather. Horses stamped and whinnied, sensing the danger, their eyes rolling white in the darkness. Enepe moved with desperate speed, grabbing a saddle and throwing it onto his mare's back. His hands were steady despite the chaos, muscle memory taking over. Celine helped as best she could, fumbling with buckles, her fingers clumsy with fear. Outside, the mob gathered, their voices rising in that terrible chant again. Torches flickered. Men shouted for rope, for justice, for blood. "They won't let us leave," Celine said, her voice shaking. "I know." Enepe finished with the saddle and turned to her, his face smudged with ash, his eyes fierce. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Good. Stay close to me. Don't stop for anything." He helped her into the saddle, his hands strong and sure, and then swung up behind her. For a moment they were pressed close together, her back against his chest, his arms around her as he gripped the reins. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body, and despite the terror singing through her veins, she felt safe. "Hold on," he said quietly. He spurred the mare forward, and they burst out of the livery at a full gallop. The mob scattered, men diving out of the way as the horse thundered past. Shots rang out. Celine heard a bullet whine past her ear, close enough that she felt the heat of it. Enepe hunched over her, shielding her with his body, and the mare ran like the wind hooves, striking sparks from the frozen ground. They made it to the edge of town before disaster struck. A rope stretched across the street, strung between two posts at just the right height to catch a rider at chest level. Enepe saw it a fraction of a second too late. He tried to rein in, tried to turn, but the mare's momentum carried them forward. The rope caught Enepe across the throat and yanked him backward off the horse with brutal force. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving every bit of air from his lungs. Black spots exploded across his vision. He tried to breathe and couldn't. His windpipe crushed his lungs, screaming for oxygen that wouldn't come. The mare bolted, carrying Celine with her. She fought the reins, trying to turn back, screaming Enepe's name. The mob closed in. They dragged Enepe to his feet, hitting and kicking him. Someone looped a noose around his neck and pulled it tight, the rough hemp biting into his bruised throat. They hauled him toward the center of town, toward the crude gallows that had been erected earlier in the day, rough lumber nailed together in haste, a crossbeam with a rope dangling from it, and a wooden crate to serve as a platform. Celine managed to turn the mare and rode back, but hands grabbed her, pulling her from the saddle, holding her as she fought and screamed and pleaded. They forced Enepe onto the crate, adjusted the noose, and stepped back. He stood tall despite everything, despite the blood running from his nose and mouth, despite the bruises darkening his face, despite the certainty of death hanging around his neck. He looked out over the crowd, his expression calm, almost serene, and his eyes found Celine's. She saw no fear in them, only a kind of sad resignation and something that might have been gratitude. Gratitude that she had tried, that she had stood with him, that he had not died alone. "No," Celine whispered. Then louder, "No, you can't do this. He's innocent." Barnaby stepped forward, his face grave and sorrowful. "This is justice," he said to the crowd. "For Coyle, for Peters, for the safety of this town." Sheriff Harlan pushed through the mob, his revolver raised, but Heavy Hank clubbed him from behind with a shovel. Harlan went down hard, unconscious, before he hit the ground. No one was left to stop them. Barnaby looked at Hank and nodded. "Do it." Heavy Hank stepped forward, his boot raised to kick the crate. And Celine did the only thing she could think of. She tore free from the hands, holding her, ran to the freight wagon parked at the edge of the crowd, the same one they had used to haul lumber for the gallows, and climbed onto the driver's seat. She grabbed the reins, screamed at the horses, and lashed them forward with all her strength. The wagon lurched, then surged forward like a battering ram. It slammed into the gallows with a sound like the end of the world. Wood screamed. Nails shrieked. The crossbeam cracked and the entire structure collapsed in on itself, timbers falling, the noose swinging wild. Enipe dropped into the snow instead of hanging cleanly. The noose yanked tight around his throat, choking, but the force was broken by the fall. He clawed at the rope, his vision going dark, and managed to get his fingers under it to pull it loose enough to draw a ragged, burning breath. Chaos erupted. Men scattered, shouting. The wagon overturned, spilling timber into the crowd. Celine was thrown clear and landed hard in the snow, and the wind knocked out of her. She lay stunned, watching the world spin. Hands pulled her up, gentle hands this time. Enipe, the noose still hanging around his neck, his face bruised and bloody, but his eyes clear and determined. "Can you run?" he rasped. "Yes." "Then run." They ran. Behind them, the mob regrouped, their fury redoubled. Barnaby's voice rose above the chaos, sharp and furious. "Don't let them escape. Stop them." Celine and Enipe ducked into the narrow alley between the saloon and the assay office, a cramped space choked with refuse and shadows. The walls pressed close on either side. Snow had drifted in the corners, and ice made the ground treacherous. Behind them, footsteps pounded, multiple sets, coming from both ends of the alley. They were trapped. Enipe looked around, his mind racing, cataloging every detail of the space. The alley was filled with debris that most people would see as garbage: old barrels, broken crates, rusted animal traps, coils of frayed rope. But Enipe saw potential. He saw weapons. He saw a battlefield. "Stay behind me," he told Celine, "and don't make a sound." He moved quickly, setting his trap with the practiced efficiency of a man who had hunted wolves and mountain lions. He looped a length of rope between two barrels hidden in shadow at ankle height. He stacked crates to create a narrow choke point. He positioned a rusted bear trap, jaws open, and spring coiled beneath a thin layer of snow, marking the spot with a barely visible scratch on the alley wall. Then he waited. Barnaby entered from one end of the alley, holding a lantern high, his small derringer in his other hand. Heavy Hank came from the other direction, carrying his revolver and a lantern of his own. Behind them, the mob pressed close, eager for blood. "Nowhere left to run, Indian." Barnaby called, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. "Come out, and I promise I'll make it quick. You have my word." Enipe said nothing. He stood in the shadows, invisible, waiting. Barnaby stepped forward cautiously. "Or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Enipe moved. He scooped up a handful of snow and hurled it at Hank's lantern with deadly accuracy. The snow struck the hot glass, and the lantern went out with a hiss, plunging half the alley into darkness. Men shouted, confused. Hank spun, trying to see, and took 2 steps forward. His boot caught the hidden rope. He pitched forward with a curse, his gun flying from his hand and skittering across the icy ground. Before he could rise, Enipe was on him, moving through the darkness like a ghost. He drove his knee into Hank's spine and wrenched the man's arm back at an angle that made Hank scream. "Tell them," Enepe hissed. "Tell them you cut the harness. Tell them Barnaby ordered you to kill her." "Go to hell," Hank spat. Enepe twisted harder, and something in Hank's shoulder popped. The scream that followed was inhuman. "Tell them." All right, all right." Hank's voice cracked with pain and terror. "Barnaby told me to do it. He said, make it look like an accident. He said, kill the girl and take the payroll. He paid me $500. The words echoed down the alley, echoed down the mob, hearing them, hesitated. Barnaby's face went white, then red. "He's lying. The Indian is torturing him, making him say, 'I'm not lying.'" Hank shouted desperation, making him reckless. "You told me she had papers that would ruin you. You said she was a spy for the investors. You said—" "Shut up." Barnaby raised his derringer and fired. The shot went wide, missing both Hank and Enepe, and struck the wall with a spray of splinters. Celine stepped out of the shadows, her voice clear and strong despite her fear. "He's telling the truth. I do have papers. Ledgers showing every theft, every fraud, every murder Barnaby Dietrich has committed. And copies have already been sent to the territorial marshal and to the investors in Philadelphia. Dr. Moore took them days ago. By now, they know everything." Barnaby's face twisted with rage, and something else panicked, the realization that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling. "You've ruined everything," he snarled. "Everything I built. But if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." He aimed the derringer at Celine and fired again. Enepe moved faster than thought. He released Hank and lunged toward Celine, putting his body between her and the bullet. The shot caught him high on the left side, just below the ribs, and the impact spun him around. He went down, hard blood spreading dark across his buckskin shirt. Celine screamed. Barnaby advanced, raising the gun for the killing shot, his face contorted with fury, and stepped directly into the bear trap. The jaws snapped shut with a sound like breaking bone. Steel teeth punched through leather and flesh and grated on bone. Barnaby shrieked a high animal sound of pure agony. The derringer fell from his hand. He collapsed, clutching at his mangled leg, blood pouring into the snow in dark, pulsing streams. Sheriff Harlan, conscious now and bleeding from a gash on his scalp, pushed through the crowd. He picked up Barnaby's fallen gun and pointed it at the mine owner with a steady hand. "It's over," Harlan said quietly. Barnaby looked up at him, his face twisted with pain and disbelief. "You fool. You've destroyed this town. Without me, there's nothing. No jobs, no money, nothing." "Better nothing than this," Harlan said. The crowd, hearing Hank's confession and seeing Barnaby's guilt written in blood and violence, began to turn. The angry mob became something else, a gathering of men who had been lied to, manipulated, used. Fury redirected. O'Rourke pushed forward a crumpled piece of paper in his shaking hand, one of the ledger pages that had scattered during the wagon collision. "This is my brother's name. You said he died in a cave-in, but it says here he was shot. And you kept his wages. You murdered him and robbed his widow." Mackenzie grabbed another page. "My cousin. Same thing." The crowd pressed closer, and for a moment it looked like they might tear Barnaby apart with their bare hands. "Stand back," Harlan commanded, his voice cutting through the rising violence. "He'll face justice. Legal justice. A trial. We're not animals. We're better than this." It was a near thing. The crowd wavered on the knife's edge between civilization and savagery. Then Martha Hilda pushed through her rifle, still in her hands, her face set in an expression that brooked no argument. "Anyone who wants to become a lynch mob can answer to me first. Now back off and let the sheriff do his job like he should have been doing all along." The crowd faced with Martha's gun, and Harlan's newfound courage slowly dispersed, muttering and casting dark looks, but ultimately backing down. Celine knelt beside Enipe in the bloody snow, her hands pressed against the wound in his side, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. Blood seeped between her fingers, hot and slick, and far too much. "You're going to be all right," she said, her voice shaking. "You have to be all right." Enipe's face was pale, his breathing shallow. "The bullet went through," he said, his voice weak but clear. "That's good. Means it didn't lodge. Don't talk. Save your strength." "Celine." He reached up with his good hand and touched her face, his fingers leaving a streak of blood on her cheek. "Thank you. For standing with me. For believing me." "Don't you dare," Celine said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare say goodbye. You don't get to save my life and then die. That's not how this ends." Enipe managed a faint smile. "Then how does it end?" "With you alive," Celine said. "With us together. With Barnaby in prison where he belongs." "Good," Enipe whispered. "I would like to see that." With Martha's help and the assistance of small Sam, who had appeared out of the chaos like a guardian angel, they got Enipe back to what was left of the surgery. Half of it had burned, but Elijah's treatment room was intact. Celine boiled water, found clean cloth, and worked by lamplight to clean and bind the wound, her hands steady despite her terror. The bullet had indeed gone through, missing the vital organs, but tearing muscle and causing significant blood loss. The risk of infection was high, but if they could keep the wound clean and keep Enipe warm, he had a chance. She sat beside him through the night, changing the dressing, monitoring his breathing, refusing to let him slip away. Once near dawn, he opened his eyes and looked at her. "You should rest," he said. "I will." Celine lied. "When you're better." "Stubborn woman." "I learned from a stubborn man." He smiled just a little and squeezed her hand. Then his eyes closed again, and she sat in the dim light, holding his hand, and prayed to any god who might be listening that he would live. Outside, Snow Peak began to change. Slowly, grudgingly, but it changed. The days that followed were a blur of pain recovery and the slow, grinding work of justice. Enipe survived. It was a near thing. Fever came on the third day, burning through him, until Celine thought she would lose him, after all but Elijah's careful treatment and Celine's stubborn refusal to let him die pulled him through. By the end of the first week, the fever broke. By the end of the second, he was sitting up and taking broth. By the end of the third, he was on his feet again, moving slowly and carefully, but alive. Barnaby Dietrich was not so fortunate. The bear trap had shattered the bones in his lower leg, and despite Elijah's best efforts, or perhaps because of a certain lack of urgency in those efforts, gangrene set in. They amputated below the knee, and Barnaby survived the surgery, but he was a broken man confined to a cell in the territorial prison to await trial. Heavy Hank, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of hanging, turned witness for the prosecution. He gave detailed testimony about Barnaby's orders, the sabotaged wagon, the stolen payroll, and a dozen other crimes. His cooperation earned him 20 years of hard labor instead of a noose. But he would spend those years knowing that every prisoner in the territory knew he was a traitor and a coward. Dr. Elijah Moore returned from the territorial capital with news that the investors had received the evidence and were filing formal charges. Barnaby's money and property were put under lock and key, out of his reach. The investors sent a man west to go through every book and ledger and see that the stolen wages were paid back. It was not perfect justice. Too many people had died. Too many families had been destroyed. But it was something. Sheriff Harlan stayed sober. He enforced the law fairly and without favor, and slowly, grudgingly, the town began to respect him again. He would never fully forgive himself for the years he had wasted, for the times he had looked away when he should have stood up. But he was trying. That counted for something. Small Sam became Ennepe's official apprentice, learning to track and hunt and read the land. The boy had found purpose, and he clung to it with fierce determination. Ennepe, in turn, found that teaching gave him something he had not realized he needed: connection. Legacy. A way to pass on what he knew to someone who would value it. Celine returned to her teaching. Her school grew as word spread that she would teach anyone, white, Lakota, Chinese, anyone who wanted to learn. The schoolhouse became a place where children of different worlds sat side by side and discovered they were not so different after all. And in the evenings when the work was done, Celine and Ennepe would sit together in Martha Hilda's parlor or walk along the frozen river, and they would talk. About everything. About nothing. About the future they were beginning to imagine together. One evening, 6 months after the night of the gallows, they stood on the overlook above the river and watched the sun set over the prairie. The land stretched out before them, vast and wild and beautiful, painted in shades of gold and crimson. "I did something," Celine said. "I hope you don't mind." "What did you do?" "I used some of the reward money. The investors paid a substantial sum for recovering the stolen assets, and I bought land. The meadow by the river, the one Barnaby had fenced off to keep your cousin's camp from accessing water. I had the deed put in my name, and then I transferred it to Galalahi. It's yours now. Your people's. Legally." Ennepe stared at her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. But I wanted to. Barnaby used land and water to starve people. I wanted to do the opposite. Give it back. Let it be used for good." Ennepe was silent for a long moment, looking out over the land that would now sustain his cousin's camp through the hard winters. Then he turned to Celine and took her hand. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why do all this? You could leave Snow Peak. Go back east. Be safe. Instead, you stay and you fight and you risk everything. Why?" Celine met his eyes, those dark, steady eyes that had seen so much pain and still held kindness. "Because of you," she said simply. "Because you rode into a storm for a stranger when no one else would. Because you stood on a gallows and didn't break. Because you showed me what real courage looks like. Because—" She paused, then said the truth that had been growing in her heart for months. "Because I love you, Ennepe. I don't know when it happened, maybe when you carried me through the blizzard, or maybe when you taught me to listen to the wind, or maybe when you were willing to die rather than let them hurt me. But I love you, and I'm not walking away from that." Ennepe's hand tightened on hers. For a long moment he did not speak. Then he said, his voice rough, "I don't have the words. I don't know how to say what I feel. But—" He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and tender that it made her heart ache. "You are the bravest person I have ever known. And if you will have me, I am yours. For as long as you'll keep me." Celine felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Is that a proposal?" "It's a promise," Ennepe said. "The rest we can figure out together." She kissed him then there on the overlook above the river, with the sun setting and the wind singing through the grass and the whole wide world spread out before them. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce and absolute, a promise made and sealed, the kind of promise that people make when they have looked death in the face and chosen life. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Celine rested her forehead against his and smiled. "So, what do we do now?" she asked. "We live," Ennepe said. "We build something good. We fight for what's right. And we do it together." "Together," Celine agreed. 6 months later, on a warm autumn afternoon when the aspens burned gold on the mountainsides and the air smelled of wood smoke and harvest, Celine Arnaud and Enepe were married. It was not a grand affair. The preacher in Snow Peak had refused to perform the ceremony, and most of the town stayed away uncomfortable with a union that crossed lines they believed should not be crossed. But the people who mattered were there. Dr. Elijah Moore stood as witness wearing his best suit, despite the cough that had settled into his lungs and would not leave. He smiled through the whole ceremony, his eyes bright with tears. Martha Hilda wore her Sunday dress and cried openly, unashamed. Sheriff Harlan stood at the back, sober and solemn. And when the ceremony ended, he shook Enepe's hand and said quietly, "You're a better man than I'll ever be. Take care of her." Small Sam cheered so loudly he spooked the horses, then ran around distributing the wooden whistles Enepe had carved as wedding favors to the children. Galalahi and the people from the riverside camp came bringing gifts, blankets, beadwork, food, and a carved cradle for the children they hoped would come. They sang songs in Lakota voices rising in harmony, and Celine listened and felt for the first time since her parents died that she belonged to something larger than herself. The ceremony itself was held on the land Celine had bought and given to Galalahi's people beside the river, where the water ran clear and fast. A Lakota elder spoke blessings in the old language, asking the spirits to watch over them. Then Elijah read a passage from the Bible about love, bearing all things, believing all things, hoping all things, enduring all things. And then Enepe and Celine exchanged the vows they had written themselves, standing together with the wind in their hair and the sun on their faces. "I promise to stand with you." Enepe said, his voice steady and clear. "In storm and in calm, in hunger and in plenty, when the world is kind and when it is cruel, I will be your partner, your protector, your friend, until the earth takes me back. I promise to see you," Celine said, tears streaming down her face. "Not as the world sees you, but as you truly are. I promise to fight beside you, to build with you, to love you without fear or shame or compromise. For all my days, for all my life, for everything I am." They sealed the promises with a kiss, and the small gathering cheered. That night they sat together by the river, watching the stars come out one by one. The camp was quiet, cook fires burning low, children asleep in their teepees. "Do you think it will be hard?" Celine asked quietly. "Living between two worlds." "Yes," Enepe said honestly. "It will be very hard. There will be people who hate us, who refuse to understand, who make our lives difficult simply because we refuse to live by their rules. But we'll have each other. Yes, we'll have each other. And that will be enough." Celine leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "Tell me about the future. What do you see?" Enepe was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. "I see children, ours and Galalahi's, and the children from town, all learning together. I see a school that teaches more than reading and writing one, that teaches how to live in this land, how to respect it, how to survive. I see people from different worlds learning to talk to each other instead of fighting." "That's a beautiful dream," Celine said. "It's not a dream," Enepe said. "It's a plan, and we'll build it together one day at a time." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the river flow, watching the stars wheel overhead. The future was uncertain. The world was still hard, still cruel in many ways. But they had survived the worst it could throw at them, and they had come through it together, stronger and more whole than they had been alone. It was not a fairy tale. There would be hard days ahead, winters that tested their endurance, prejudice, that cut deep losses that would bring them to their knees. But they would face it together, And that made all the difference. Years later, people in Snow Peak would tell stories about the winter of the Great Blizzard, about the Lakota warrior who rode into the storm, and the woman who saved him from the gallows. Some versions would be true. Others would not. Stories have a way of changing, of smoothing the rough edges, of making heroes larger than life. But the truth, the real truth, was simpler and deeper than any story. Two people found each other in the worst of circumstances. They chose courage over fear, love over hate, and partnership over loneliness. They built a life that had room for both of them in a world that said such a life was impossible. And they lived? Not happily ever after, because life is not that simple. But they lived fully, fiercely, and together. And in the end, that was more than enough.